progress with this, a lot of governing boards still struggle with it, where they were not very diverse. They were primarily made up of individuals who were older, they were white, typically they were male, and especially during the 60s and 70s, as there was increased diversification within the student body at colleges and universities, and hand in hand with that, an increased amount of awareness of different social issues, different international issues, such as South African apartheid and the Vietnam War. There was an increase in student activism on college campuses trying to draw attention to, trying to draw the governing board's attention to these particular issues. And the student protest movement is one of the hallmarks of the 1960s and 70s, and led to a variety of changes both within the United States more broadly and within higher education more specifically. So students really were trying to get a voice within decision-making processes. In my research, it was comparatively rare for students to have any direct involvement with governing boards prior to the establishment of student trustee positions. I had found attempts by young alumni or students to get elected to governing boards. However, given the lack of, well, broad-based media and social media that we have today that make such campaigns more able to be successful, that really wasn't the case back in the 60s. And so once the voting age was lowered in the United States from 21 to 18, that's really when you started to actually see student trustees being added to public boards more generally. People at that time, they weren't sure necessarily how young voters were going to vote. Although today, typically, there is the generalization that younger voters around the age of 18 to 25 are a little bit more Democratic than Republican. We didn't know that at the time. This was an entirely newly franchised group. And so to try to curry favor with those new voters, passing these laws to amend public governing boards to include students, usually that would mean a student seat as opposed to multiple, although different states handle it in different ways. That was primarily the impetus for those laws to be passed. And yes, it was doing its work to try to diversify the board, not just in terms of age, but in a lot of cases, gender, race, ethnicity, those sorts of things. There still was a lot of work to do, and still is a lot of work to do today.
Absolutely. And that was something that I myself, didn't know until speaking to you a few weeks ago. And I am curious to know whether many of our audience members knew was the root of many of these student trustee positions. But I'm curious, following up on that, why it was that state governments in particular chose to address this uncertainty around how young people would vote when the voting age was lowered through university governing boards in particular. Was that an effective strategy for them? Why was that the strategy that they chose?
By and large, in the interviews I've done with people at the time who were at the forefront of movements attempting to do this, from what I could tell, it was primarily people were aware, the state actors were aware that students were at the forefront of these activist movements. So higher education was kind of in the minds of state actors as they were passing these laws or considering things. And really, something I found interesting was the legislative back and forth and how these positions ultimately came into being. Where yes, it was democratizing governing boards to allow student voice a little bit more, but with regards to state boards and state universities, there still usually was that level of control on the part of the state actors, usually the governor, to actually appoint the student trustee themselves. So you were able to, it was kind of more at the forefront of their minds. I haven't really found any evidence showing that there was any short-term effect in terms of governors passing these laws or signing these laws into effect, actually having some sort of electoral benefit for them or their party in the next election if they weren't eligible. But that appeared to be the mindset at the time. And from the interviews I've done with people who were trying to advocate for this, that was one of the angles they routinely used to be able to actually persuade state legislators and state governors to move forward with these sorts of positions in the first place.
That's Really interesting, and leads me to my next question, which is for our second panelist, Dick. So I imagine that Princeton, as a private university, operated under a bit different incentives than its public counterparts. And I'm curious what led up to the creation of the Young Alumni Trustee position that you inaugurated in 1968, 1969 when you came into it. Could you describe a little bit about your involvement in that process up until the point when you were chosen as the first Young Alumni Trustee?
Well, you have to remember what a tumultuous time it was on college campuses in the late 1960s. 1968, the spring of 1968, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for president again because of what was going on in Vietnam. Bobby Kennedy looked as though he were going to get the nomination. He was assassinated in June of 68. Martin Luther King had been assassinated in March of 1968, which led to a lot of civil unrest in many major cities around the country. There are a lot of protests at a lot of the private universities in particular, as well as state universities. 69 followed with more protests. 1970, when the US military went into Cambodia, college campuses really exploded. And it was the spring of 1970 when the Ohio National Guard shot 4 students at Kent State during a peaceful demonstration. And police in Jackson, Mississippi shot 2 students at Jackson State University in Mississippi. So lots of protests, lots of violence, lots of arrest. And Princeton, while it was not, no one regarded Princeton as a radical university, but there were still many, many protests. And what happened in the spring, or probably February of I can't remember, it was the fall of 69 or I think it was the fall of 69, a group of Black students sat in at the university administration building protesting the university's investment in companies that invested in South Africa. And that drew a lot of attention. And there were ongoing protests about ROTC on campus and really the Vietnam War and research that was being done by various departments at the university on behalf of the US military. So the administration of the university, and I don't mean the board really, I really mean the president and the provost and people like that, met with some students. I had already graduated in 1968. They started meeting with students during the course of 1969 about what could be done to bring more young people into the governance structure. And ultimately they came up with a solution that was announced in the spring of 1969. And what that really involved was introducing a new brand of alumni trustee called a Young Trustee, or by the naysayers called kiddie trustees. And the idea was there would always be, we would start with 2, and every year a graduating senior would be elected to the board for a 4-year term. So Brent Henry was a senior, and he was one of the Black students who sat in at the university administration building. He and I were elected at the same time. And the election process was a group of students at the university basically selected 3 nominees. I didn't run for it. I was just told I was a nominee, and did I want to do it? And I said, sure. So it was an election, and then this has been true of all cases since. The 2 most senior classes at the university voted, and as well as the 2 most recently graduated classes. And I ran against 2 other recent alums. You had to write a very, very short statement. They gave you a bio about your background, and then you wrote a very short statement, and the ballots go out. And it's sort of how they do alumni trustees in general. The structure of the board at that time, basically the board was run by charter trustees. Charter trustees were appointed by the existing board to a 10-year term. And then alumni trustees were elected. One was a national alumni, and the rest were regional alums. But they were a minority on the board, and the board was really dominated and controlled by the charter trustees, all of whom occupied the chair positions in all the relevant committees, as well as the chair of the board overall. There were probably 30 trustees in general. At that point, I think Princeton has grown a little bit, but I think it's still rough. And anyway, in those days, about 30. So that's how it came about. Brent and I were appointed to important committees. We were accepted as we had the full vote. There was no limitations on what we could say or what we could vote on. I'm sure there were times when we would get lobbied by. There was a vote on something relating to the Vietnam War. Brent and I had introduced a resolution for the board to adopt. And we got lobbied on that with phone calls from other board members opposed to it. But in the end, and our resolution failed, but it was a good open discussion. So it was not, I think the administration led by President Govine and Provost Bill Bowen, who became the next president of Princeton, were very supportive of the concept of young trustees, very supportive of the young trustees who came onto the board. We had, if you wanted to partake in it, there was a very good orientation session. As a student, I knew nothing about the administration of the university. I didn't really know, I just was focusing on students and on my studies and on sports, basically. Maybe that's why they put me on the board, because I knew nothing. But you really could pick up a lot very, very quickly. So I had made a couple of trips to Princeton from law school. I went down there again the summer before I went on the board in the fall of '69. I met with a lot of the university administrators, including the chief financial officer, the provost, the president. Had access to a lot of things I'd never seen before, financial statements, endowment investments. Got a tutorial from not only the chief financial officer, but also the chief investment officer of the university. So I really learned a tremendous amount about the university. And so it was a good experience. We were not held at arm's length in any way.
I'm glad to hear it. And relatedly, it sounds like the university was really a pioneer in this position in general. I have not found many other universities that had a position like this one as early as Princeton did. And I'm curious what the hopes for this position were when you came into it. Did people have faith that it would contribute something meaningful to Princeton's governance? Did you have faith that it would? How did you prepare yourself for it?
Well, I think one of the differences in talking about the student elections to a state university, we were not running a political campaign. I mean, we were not nominated by the board. We were nominated by other students, but we weren't really running on a platform. Maybe that's changed a little bit over time as the universities have become, I think as people saw these positions as a way to introduce new ideas to the board. I mean, we introduced ideas. We talked about endowment in South Africa. We talked about the Vietnam War a lot. We talked about ROTC. But in the end, we didn't make any difference, except I think some of the older trustees had a better understanding of what students were thinking and what they cared about. Also, the other thing that I think the Young Trustee program did at Princeton, because remember, there's a new one elected every year. So at any one point, there's 4 young trustees on the board. They're not current students, but they spent 4 years at Princeton, and they're now either in a job or they're at graduate school or law school or business school or teaching or whatever. But over time, what it really enabled this university to do is to diversify the board. When I was at Princeton, it was an all-male student body. And women were introduced for the first time as students in the fall of 1969. That decision was made before Young Trustees went on the board. That had been in the works under student pressure for a long time. But the university wanted women too. It was more trying to get the alumni ready for it. So, but over the years, a lot of the Brent Henry was a person of color. And over the years, a lot of women were elected as young trustees. There was no woman on the Princeton board when I went on the Princeton board. I think it was in 1970, 2 women were elected to the board, and they happened to be daughters of former charter trustees. Very active participants and were very independent women, but they got their position largely because I think they were daughters of former charter trustees. So, but since then it's changed dramatically. I mean, a lot of the young trustees who've gone on the board are women. There's a couple of the women who are young trustees they went off the board, and maybe 12, 15 years later, they went back on the board in a different capacity as an older alumni trustee. So they brought diversity in terms of color. Brent Henry was the first Black trustee of the Princeton board. And I think, the first woman graduate who was served on the Princeton board was probably 4 or 5 years later, both as a result of young trustees. So I think it served the purpose of introducing some younger voices to the board at a time when it was really needed. And it also introduced diversity, not just age, but also gender and race.
That's great to hear. And also one of the many arguments that we use for why young people deserve seats on higher education boards is that younger generations tend to be the most diverse, at least in the US, across many demographics. Another question relatedly for the both of you actually is, how do you see the intention of these roles as student trustees or young alumni trustees reflected in their current structure, either term length or the number of positions on the board, or the roles and responsibilities that they have on the board, as well as who tends to serve in these positions? And we can start with Dr. Lozano, how you see the actual intentions and why these positions were founded reflected in who serves in the positions and their structure and practice.
Sure. So in terms of the original intent, in terms of including that student or young alum voice, from the research I've done, it really varies a lot about whether or not they're actually meeting that intention. Because at a lot of universities, and Princeton apparently very early on, I think, got it right, where you're including more than just a single person on the board that's fulfilling that role. If you have one student trustee, one young alum trustee, you're putting a lot on that person to actually communicate the diverse needs of all students, all young alums. And they're going to be coming at it with a lens that maybe they understand of their own experiences and the experiences of some different populations of students, but especially as we're an ever more diverse country and an ever more diverse population of students at every university across the country, no one person is going to be able to accurately capture all those experiences to make sure that the diverse needs of student populations are represented, to make sure that the boards understand what those needs are. And so, especially since most boards only have one of those kinds of positions, in my mind, it really needs to happen that, one, there needs to be either more of these positions for young alums or for students, or there needs to be some more active engagement from governing boards at either the committee levels or other levels within the university governance structure to actively engage people to make sure that you aren't excluding people. Because in looking at who's typically, at least on the student trustee side of things, who's typically serving in these roles, it's people who have come up through student government, who have been student government vice presidents, presidents, those sorts of positions. And if you look at who's primarily in those sorts of positions, it's people who they're able to more readily afford to go to higher education in the college. They're not working simultaneously. They aren't, and that means a lot of low income students, a lot of students and a lot of students of color who might be first gen students. They're not necessarily getting into these pipeline positions that are putting them in the position to become a student trustee or young alum trustee. So there's these large swaths of experiences that governing boards don't adequately understand. And beyond that, you also are dealing with the fact that within governing boards, it is a political process. So you are going to see that sometimes vetting committees, it's going to distill down who's actually going to be serving into those sorts of positions to make sure that, well, you're not getting somebody who's going to vary too much in one extreme or another, but that also means that they maybe aren't going to be they aren't always going to be the most well-informed person. And I can tell you, having served on a selection committee for student trustees a couple times, that you get a lot of experience. You also just see the same kinds of people, the same kinds of experiences, because they're the ones who knows these positions exist. So there's a lot of legwork that needs to be done in order to make sure that you're actually including a large variety of students in the governance process. And a single young alum trustee position or a single student trustee position, I don't think cuts it anymore in higher education.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the irony of the way student trustees are elected is that you probably don't get the mix you would really like to get. And that you probably would get if you had a sophisticated board selecting students, or a sophisticated group of students selecting representatives to the board to balance. So if you've got 4 positions and there's a new one coming on every year, you should be able to get balance. When you're electing them, it's much harder to get that balance, I think. It's sort of one of the ironies of the process. That you want a democratic process, but you also really want some diversity among young people, as well as diversity on the entire board. And the truth is, Princeton, with its 4 young alumni trustees, is still not going to recognize diversity. It takes the leader of the president of the university and the chair of the board to be sophisticated enough and smart enough and mature enough to go ahead and know they need to diversify the board. And you can't do it through young alums only. You're never going to get there.
And that's the other thing there as well, where with Princeton and a lot of these young alum trustees, where they are serving 3-4 year terms, student trustees don't get anywhere near that amount of time. Usually it's 2 years, maybe 3 if you're lucky. So they're coming on the board. They don't have in-depth orientations, because a lot of boards of trustees, they kind of look at the first year as a learning year in a lot of cases. And for a student trustee, that means half your term is figuring out what you're even doing in this position. You have one good year where you're able to operate maybe at the same level of sophistication as a board member who's in their second, third term. So they've been on the board for 6 to 9 years, and then they're out. So there's a lot of reforms that are necessary for the student trustee model, and maybe shifting to a young alum model is might be with a longer term, so a 4-year term potentially, or allowing for multiple terms is possibly a good way to go, besides incorporating young alum or student voices on governing board committees more to a greater degree.
I think one of the advantages of having 4 in a rotating, so one person goes off every year, is when a new person comes on, he or she has 3 different people they can talk to learn about what the issues are, and really figure out what they should be talking about and worrying about. The other advantage of having a multiple year term is that after the first year, if you have a welcoming board, you really get to know the other board members. And there's a lot of casual meetings, dinner meetings during the course of a weekend of meetings, where you get to know the people pretty well, and you get a good sense of what they care about and whether there's some commonality. It's very difficult if you're being there 1 year and all you do is show up for a meeting and it lasts 3 hours and you go away. I mean, you're not going to build any relationships. And it was possible to build relationships over a 3-year term, and also because the meetings tended to stretch over a whole weekend, and you would really get to know some of the other trustees who were a lot older but had some things in common with you, and some things they cared about, you cared about.
Certainly. And speaking of shifts in these positions and what is necessary and what benefited student trustees, or maybe yourself, Dick, in these sorts of positions, have you noticed important shifts in how these roles have contributed to boards over the past few decades? So maybe Dick, since you served in your position, I don't know if you have caught up with how Young Alumni Trustees have been able to contribute to Princeton since then on the board, but have you noticed any shifts in how they have been able to? And do you think that they are important or minute in any ways? I'm curious.
I think they are important. I mean, because it's a different voice. And so when you're thinking about some of the critical issues that universities are facing, whether it's scholarships or tuition fees or investments in, climate change and all of that, whether it's social investing or any issues that the university is facing almost on a daily basis, I think it is important to have that other voice. And I think over the years, simply because it's become part of the way the board operates, those voices are listened to. And it doesn't mean the board's going to make significant changes just because a young trustee says they should. But I think over time, it does have an impact in certain areas. But it's probably depends so much on the university. It's so much easier at a private university in many ways because public universities are so incredibly political, where most of the boards are appointed by the governor. You have a Republican governor and then he leaves office or she leaves office and then another party comes in and another party after that. And there's enormous shifts. And so it's not a particularly healthy system, I don't think. But that's the way we're set up. I mean, they are public institutions funded by state legislatures. It's one of the advantages, I think, of private universities.
Right. And I see that there are 2 questions in the chat. Before we get to those, I will follow up with the same question for Dr. Lozano, and then maybe we can move to some audience questions that Jasmine can pick up on. But Dr. Lozano, to get to you with the same questions, have you noticed any sort of important shifts in how these roles have contributed to the boards that they serve on in a positive or negative way?
I mean, by and large, I have found that governing boards governing board members at institutions that have student trustees, they seem to at least believe they understand student need, student activity a little bit better than those that don't. I have found that that boards that don't have student trustees do need to do a little bit more. Well, they're more prone to do outreach to student government and student organizations. So it does actually make those students feel a little bit more heard, oddly enough, than when there is a student trustee. And a part of that is actually, and this is kind of based off some of the research I've done, kind of like some possible inferences into that, is that I think that has to do with some concerns that student trustees have about issues of conflict of interest and being seen as being monolithic advocates for purely student concerns, as opposed to taking on the holistic set of duties and set of concerns that a normal trustee would hold. So there is, I feel like, a little bit more that student trustees are maybe at times a little bit more apt to rein themselves in from being an advocate when they possibly could be an advocate or should be an advocate. So and that's kind of like one of those big concerns that AGB has gone on about student trustees as well, where there is that concern about fiduciary duty and conflict of interest because you have an ongoing relationship with the university at that time, and some of the things you're going to be voting on, like room and board, tuition, you have a vested stake in. And honestly, I think those concerns are a little bit overblown, and it's not really backed up in the research that those concerns have any kind of basis in reality. But young alum trustees are one of the solutions to that. So honestly, I think I haven't seen a negative to having student trustees or more student engagement with governing boards. But I don't think that today, just with the way that universities are more diverse, that you're getting the same level of impact, the same level of benefit of having a student trustee today than you would like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Great, thank you for that. And with that, we have more questions in our back pocket, but our audience members have asked some great ones already. So I will hand it off to Jasmine to read off the first, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so let's start with a question from Paul Commoners. This is primarily for Dr. Lozano. Wondering, have you tracked whether recent graduate or student trustees return to the board later on? Saying that I know that they do often at MIT, but I don't have a broader sense. So if you can kind of give any insight about that trend.
That's not something I have tracked, unfortunately. I can say anecdotally, though, that it does happen. It happens relatively often, although it's not something that you're going to see every student trustee come back and be a trustee 10, 15 years later. But at the very least, relative to other kind of student roles that like student government presidents, vice presidents, things like that, I have, when I've done tracked specific student trustees or done interviews with people who've served in those roles, they've oftentimes gone back into university governance, either at the same institution, or if they were a grad student when they were a student trustee, maybe when they would serve at their undergraduate institution later.
Nice, great. Another question is kind of about student activism and student trustees and the relationship between kind of those two roles or groups. Is there any concern that student trustees might serve to reduce student activism or the impact of student activism generally? Might other leaders, including trustees, say something like, hey, you have a student voice or vote on the board, so that's where we look for student input?
All I can say is from my experience, it certainly did not reduce student activism at all. But that was it. I mean, the late 60s were, as I said, very tumultuous. Probably people talk a lot about what's going on in the country right now. I think it was even much more divided in many ways back in the late 60s than it is today. So it did not reduce student activism at all. The thing that I often wonder about, right, I didn't have that much contact with other with students, except when I went back on the campus and I would try to meet with students when I was there. But I didn't really have that much contact with other young Princeton alumni because I was in law school and they were off doing their thing. And you didn't communicate by email because it didn't exist. And people didn't want to use the phones because it was too expensive. So, it was just, you didn't really get the communication. I wonder now, student trustees and young alum trustees must get bombarded with communications about, you got to do this, you got to do that. And it just was not like that at all back then. You really had to try to learn about the issues. There was a big freedom of speech issue at the university, maybe my second year. And, right today, if that happened, I'm sure people on both sides would be emailing and communicating. But the only way to do it back then was actually go on a campus and talk to people about it and see what had happened. So it's very different now. But at least my experience was it did not reduce student activism. I think people understood, though, there was a voice there and that maybe that made them feel better, but didn't stop them from protesting, at least back in the late 60s.
I would say that it's much the same now, where the presence of a student trustee isn't necessarily going to cut back on the amount of activism, because typically speaking, there's only one student member of that governing board, and it's going to be impossible for them to, fully understand the different experiences that students are having. And so if there's students who are engaging in activism on campus on a specific issue, the student trustee might feel that they should, and they probably should, meet with these students to kind of understand what's going on with them. Because I know from personal experiences, having served as an ex officio trustee, that when there's protests going on campus on a specific issue, the governing board members are going to be asking you, well, what's going on with this? What do you know about it? And they're going to you to be educated as much as they might meet the students who are engaging in that activism to better understand things. And because of that similar age that you're going to have, that a student trustee or a young alum trustee might have to student activists, even if they're meeting with senior level administrators about the same issues, they're going to frame it in a different way to you than they would a senior level administrator or another member of the board. So it's that different perspective that you're going to have talking with students that it's going to be a different lens. You're going to have to be able to bring a different take to it. And so I don't see the student activism being something that's lessened by the presence of a student trustee. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, thank you both for sharing your perspectives in response to that question. We have one more at the moment from Danielle. She said, Harvard has abysmal engagement with board elections. Less than 15% of alumni typically vote. And I'd say most alumni don't know what the board does or who is on it. I feel like student or recent alumni board members are good for increasing community engagement, but they seem to often run into norms or rules around board secrecy. Do either of you have any thoughts on how we can increase board transparency and engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think back on the issues that were so in the forefront of events at the university when I was on the board. And on those issues, if you wanted to know about them, you could find out about them. And we talked about the decisions and the lack of decisions in terms of ROTC and investments in South Africa and investments by the Defense Department into departments at the university. So I think, I mean, so people could find out about the issues. It's not as the board meetings were not open to all students, but the decisions that were made or not made were made public. So it wasn't as though the key issues that the students most cared about were well known. It wasn't, students at a school like Princeton didn't care about the tuition and sort of money issues as much as some students might do at other universities, in part because if you needed money, you could get a scholarship or you could get a loan. So if there was a 5% increase in the tuition and room and board in 1 year, we didn't have protest over that. The protests were really much more over issues of the day: Vietnam, South Africa, diversity in terms of women at the university, Defense Department involvement at the university. Those were some of the things and there were freedom of speech issues surrounding the Vietnam War, which were really became big issues and flashpoints as well. But the actions of the board were known. It wasn't secret. The comment that people don't vote on board elections is absolutely true. The turnout in American elections in general is abysmal, but they're even worse at board sessions and board elections. But I know, but you have to be very active. I know that I get to vote on the Yale elections to their board because I went to the law school there. And so I get all those materials. I know a number, like probably 10, 15 years ago, there was a big issue, and it was town-gown relations between New Haven and the university, as I recall. And so a group of students wanted to elect someone, an alum, who was very active on behalf of the residents of New Haven. And I believe they succeeded in getting him elected. I mean, it was, and they waged a proxy fight, what I would call in the corporate world would be called a major proxy fight. And they started mailings and they called people and solicited votes. So you can get the vote out, but you really have to work at it.
I mean, I'm gonna echo that in terms of like, you can get the vote out. I'm an alum a few times over from Penn State, and we have alumni trustees. Let me just preface this by saying I don't necessarily approve of why more people are turn out for the Penn State alum trustee elections, but a lot of them are single issue voters who are very much they want more recognition for Joe Paterno after all the Sandusky stuff, and that has led to a significant increase in trustee elections since I first started voting when I graduated there in undergrad in 2008. When I was at that point in time, maybe 10,000 people total in an alumni association that has 500,000 members would vote. Now there's 20, 30, 40, some years 50,000 people who are voting. Granted, still pretty bad, but it's a lot more people. And you have individuals who are engaging in full-scale campaigns. They're spending not insignificant amounts of money to have websites, town hall events, that sort of thing to campaign. But if we're talking about trying to engage with engage in other ways, just raise awareness so that you do have people who have different viewpoints, different experiences running for board positions. I think a big part of that is, well, at public universities, I know that the board meetings are open. Private universities, it varies the degree to which the public is allowed to be at business meetings. So I think that part of that is trying to engage with like social media or having news organizations that are either student run or young alum run that are monitoring what kinds of issues are going on there to rate, so that you're talking about what the board is doing, what's going on either through Twitter, through blog posts, that sort of thing, to make sure that you're touching on these variety of issues. And there's going to be different things that different people are interested in. So covering the broad base of what's going before a board, what could be coming before a board, to kind of like help people understand like how these arcane processes affect the daily lives of students now, or for those who just graduated, how this decision that's coming up now would have made their lives better or worse if they were still a student. So it's trying to make sure that there are those other bodies that are, I don't want to say keeping boards accountable, but keeping boards transparent. So either be that like attending those meetings or just live tweeting about things that are coming out of those board meetings. So a lot of it is just making sure you have those kinds of organizations that are willing to do it.
Thank you both for that answer. And to follow up on it, I actually have a question for a couple of our audience members if they feel comfortable answering it, because I believe both Paul and Darren come from backgrounds as young trustees themselves. And I was curious to know, are your questions informed by your personal experience, or, I'm curious about the impetus to your questions and how they might feature into the conversation that we're having with both of our panelists, if you feel comfortable sharing.
Is Paul, you can jump in. This is Darren.
I was hoping you would jump in.
I'll go first. Well, I'm a strong advocate, for what a student. I don't come from the Young Alumni Trustee. In Minnesota, we're unique because the regents of the University of Minnesota are elected by the legislature. There are 12 regents. 8 come from the 8 congressional districts, and then there are 4 at large. One of the at-large members has to be a student at the time of election, and it's a full 6-year voting term, which is somewhat unusual. And when I was there, I met a number of student trustees from across the country, and they were, typically would have a 1 or 2 year term. We also have non-voting student representatives that sit on our committees, not at the board meeting itself, but on the committee. So there's a lot of robust input. I really like the capacity of the student member to bring things alive. And one of my colleagues is on this Zoom as well, James Farnsworth. He's actually an undergraduate, but was elected to a congressional district seat. So we have the student member, and then we also have Regent Farnsworth. So we've got very good representation there. But as I do with virtually anything, or at least I try to, is rather than just sort of accepting that my preference is infallible, I look and say, well, what are the possible downsides? Are there any possible downsides to having this type of representation? Because I do, from a personal standpoint, we would have issues that would be somewhat contested by the student body, and myself and the preceding student members. Minnesota started in '77, and even after, if the other regents were able to secure support from the student member, oftentimes informed by his or her own personal experience, such as their capacity to pay a tuition increase or their personal view about a specific issue of public policy, that would make the rest of the board potentially feel comfortable that the student concerns had been met because that individual was brought along on the issue. And I think it's a fair question to say, all the upsides that have been very, I think, clearly articulated this evening. And I think, most of us in this call have some affinity for this representation. Is there the potential for that to to limit or reduce to some extent people outside of that position to have input. And I think it's just something we need to be mindful of. I don't have the answer to it. That's why I was very curious as to other people's perspectives.
I'll add only very quickly that all of this has really resonated with what I experienced at MIT as a recent grad trustee and as an observer of the whole thing in the subsequent years. MIT also created its recent graduate trustee positions in the wake of Vietnam War era protests, which were particularly acute there because MIT was on a number of Defense Department contracts that students felt were intimately involved with the Vietnam War. There were a number of other levers that got instituted. There were a number of other places where students got access to the levers of power. And the general sense is that that did actually simmer down protesting for a number of years. It obviously never fully erased student activism, and now a number of acute fights focus on efforts to claw back some of that power towards the administration and take students out of the process. The only other thing that I'll add is that in the entire time I've been there and for some number of years beforehand, the recent graduate trustees are elected by a ballot that is constructed by the current recent graduate trustees. And I've always thought that was a very useful mechanism for ensuring the overall quality of the pool, because the recent grad trustees do to some extent stand or fall as a group. If a more senior board member loses patience with one of us, he will often lose patience with many of us. I say he because MIT's board, although much more diverse than it was in the 1960s, is still predominantly male and older. And so nobody has an incentive to keep the quality of the recent graduate trustees high, like the current recent graduate trustees do.
It's interesting that you say they're talking. I'm sorry, didn't mean to. That you're saying that MIT is trying to take some of that power back from students to some degree, because like I've never heard of that happening in any other situation where there's been some of that greater engagement of students, and I really feel like that can't be going over well.
It hasn't, and it doesn't. It doesn't center on the recent graduate trustees seats. Frankly, those are configured in a way that it would be awkward to change them. Everyone serves a 5-year term like any other typically appointed board member. You elect one every year. When you start fiddling with that, the mechanics just get wonky, and it doesn't make a lot, and you can't really play with it without eliminating it. It tends to show up more in access to formal powers like faculty committees, where either the faculty are trying to slough off the students or the administration is trying to bypass the faculty. Or it tends to show up in generally decreased autonomy and self-governance. MIT used to have incredibly strong self-governance in dorms and living groups, and it's been trending away from that, I think, long before I arrived, and the trend is continuing long after I graduated.
Well, thank you, Paul, and also Darren, for sharing those experiences. I think they added something unique and valuable to this conversation that I, at least, was not aware about before you brought them up. So thank you both for contributing. And with that, we are at the hour mark that we allotted for this conversation. So I will mark a stopping time for everyone, but want to say thank you to all of our audience members who came out tonight on your Tuesday afternoon or evenings. Thank you to our panelists for bringing your individual unique experiences. Dr. Lozano, through your academic work, and Dick, through an experience that you had many years ago, but that you seem to remember and continue to contribute in many ways to your life now. I've really enjoyed listening, and I hope you all have as well. Thank you to Jasmine, as always, for helping support this program, our awesome educational programs team member. And with that, I will remind you all, we have another event coming up on Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern time this week called Breaking Into the Boys Club, that will be focused on the intersection of gender and youth in the boardroom. So everyone who's interested in coming to that event as well, it will be a panel format similar to this one. You can register on our website at theboardingschool.org. And I will be staying on afterwards. Anyone else is welcome to stay on as well and continue asking questions in the conversation, but I want to let our panelists go, and as well as other audience members go if they need to. And thank you all for coming.